All right, can y'all hear me? Can you hear me? All right, well let's go ahead and get started. It's 6 o'clock on the dot, I believe. So we got a lot to cover tonight. So let's go ahead and get started with a prayer. Father in heaven, I just want to thank you so much for allowing us to be here tonight. We thank you for our church and for all the people that are involved with it. We thank you for your son Jesus and for the sacrifice that he made for us. I just pray tonight as we study from the book of Daniel that you'll help us to learn what you would want us to learn tonight. Help us to learn from the wisdom, the humility that Daniel and his friends showed. And I just pray that you'll be with me tonight as I teach, that the words that I speak will be in accordance with your will. And again, we just love you and thank you for all that you do for us. In Christ's name we pray, amen. All right, so I think tonight, I'm not going to do this every week, but I think because chapter 1 is not quite as long as some of the other chapters, I'm going to read the entire first chapter. But just as a warning, I'm not going to do this every week because like next week, for instance, it's almost 50 verses, and so it would take a little too long to do that. So let's go ahead and read chapter 1, and then we'll get into it. It says, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Aspenaz, chief of the court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table, and they were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. And among those who were chosen were some from Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked to them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. All right, so just kind of a reminder of what we talked about last week. If you remember that it was 605 BC that Nebuchadnezzar led the Babylonian army to Jerusalem, which was the capital, obviously, of Judah. So if you remember, he had defeated the Egyptians and what was left of the Assyrian army at the Battle of Carchemish. And so then he headed south to Jerusalem, and as you know, the Israelites were no match for the Babylonians, and so they surrendered to them. And actually, this is something, we mentioned a little bit about this last week, but this is something that had been predicted. In fact, 100 years prior to this, it had been predicted by Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 39, and then also a few years before this in Jeremiah chapter 25. And they had been told in those prophecies that because the Jews had failed to obey God, that they were going to be punished with captivity in Babylon. And even Moses had talked about this way back in Deuteronomy chapter 28 when he talked about how that God, if the Jews didn't remain faithful to them, was going to overtake them by a foreign nation and take them and punish them for their disobedience. So now Nebuchadnezzar, as we talked a little bit about last week, his goal wasn't to destroy the Israelites altogether. In fact, if you remember, he left Jehoiakim as king of Jerusalem. So he left him as this vassal king, and Jerusalem as this vassal nation, meaning he was going to still serve as king, but they were going to be obedient now to the Babylonians. And so then in chapter 1, we see two things that happen here that was a very common occurrence when one nation conquered another nation, or when that country became a vassal country of the other nation. And the first thing was that, the slides didn't go. And the first thing was that the conquered country would turn over as a token to the conquering country a part of their deity, or really what essentially would be a statue of their god. And so that was a common thing that occurred. In fact, we actually have a historical example of this back in the 12th century BC when the Elamites defeated the Babylonians. And when they did, the Babylonians turned over their statue of their god, which was Marduk. And we'll talk a little bit about their god Marduk a little bit later. And so then Marduk was taken in place into the temple of the Elamites. So it was kind of like capture the flag. You took over a country, and then as a token, you would take that country's god back with you. We actually have a similar situation to this in 1 Samuel chapter 4 and 5, where, if you remember, the Philistines had defeated the Israelites, and the Israelites were under the direction of Eli's sons, who were Hophni and Phinehas. And so when they did, the Philistines took the ark of God back with them. And what they did is they took the ark and they put it in their temple, and they set it right next to their god Dagon. And amusingly or amazingly, they came back the next morning and Dagon's fell down on his face. And so they're like, well, that's odd. They picked him back up and left, and then he came back the next morning, except this time he'd fallen down again, and his arms and head has fallen off as well. And so here in Daniel, there's no statue, right? So there's no statue of Yahweh. That would have been prohibited to do that. And this would have been very unique in the ancient Near East, because everybody had a statue of their god, but the Israelites didn't. And so also the Ark of the Covenant seems to be gone at this stage. We're not sure really what happened to it. The last time we read about it is in 2 Chronicles chapter 35, when King Josiah, we talked a little bit about him last week. He was one of the last good king, and he had kind of had this revival, and so he brings the ark back into the temple. But then after that, we're not sure what happened to it. There's speculation, and some people say, well, because of the Babylonians coming, people hid the ark so that the Babylonians wouldn't take it. So with no idol or no ark to take, the Babylonians do the next best thing, which was to take the various articles that are used in the temple, rituals, and so they take those articles and they place them, Nebuchadnezzar does, back in Babylon in the treasure house of his god, including gold and silver goblets that we're going to read about later when we get to chapter 5, and we talk about that banquet that Belshazzar gives. And so the reason for doing this is that during those times when one nation conquered another nation, the common thought was that it meant that the the conquering nation's God, so in this case, Babylon, it meant that their gods were stronger than the gods that they just defeated. So in other words, they're saying, hey, our God, in this case, Marduk, is stronger than your God, Yahweh, so we're going to take stuff from your temple. And another thought, too, was that it meant that your God has come over to our side. And so when Nebuchadnezzar walks into the temple of the Israelites and takes the sacred articles from the temple, he's showing that his God is bigger and stronger than the God of the Israelites. And then the second result of taking another king, of taking another country captive, is that the country that's conquered, that vassal country, you would take prisoners from that country, and then you would take them back and attempt to sort of reprogram them in order that they would now serve the Babylonian Empire. And so here Nebuchadnezzar decides to take back with him to Babylon some of the best young men from the noble families. Right, we see in verse 3, it says, he found young men with no physical defect who were handsome, smart, well-informed, quick to understand. Essentially, they were the best of the best that Judah had to offer. And so we know among these, as we read, were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And so Nebuchadnezzar's intent in doing this was really to take them and others and really shape them intellectually, politically, and even physically into what he wanted them to become. So really, he's doing a lot of things here. Some of it may even be psychological, right? He's trying to diminish the future of Israel by taking away Israel's future, right? The best and the brightest that Israel has to offer, Nebuchadnezzar's taking them away. And so he's going to teach them the Babylonian language, the literature, and the lifestyle. And what he's planning on getting back from them is their loyalty. And so I just want us to think just a second about how these young men would have felt they're getting marched off to Babylon. And we know from verse 4 that they're young men. And so I guess the question is, how young are they? Well, we know from chapter 10 of Daniel that Daniel at least lived to the third year of King Cyrus. So that's 536 BC was the third year of King Cyrus. So that's 70 years from this point in time. So we know at least 70 more years he's alive. And so most people speculate that Daniel and his friends here are about 14 or 15 years old. So they're 14 or 15-year-old teenagers that are taken away from their families, right? They're taken away from their friends, from the people who follow the same God that they do. They're taken away from the culture and the customs that they've grown up with, and also from people who spoke their language. You know, think about that. You're going to a country where nobody speaks the language that you know. And then also the distance they traveled is, by the way they would have had gone to Babylon, most people think it would have been about a 900-mile journey that they went on. We know in the book of Ezra that when Ezra went from Babylon back to Jerusalem, it took him about 4 months. So it was a tough, long journey that these young men had been on. And then the last thing is, mentally, you know, they're getting punished for sins that they had nothing to do with, right? These are sins of their ancestors, their parents, and people that they, you know, they're getting punished for something that they had nothing to do with. So then just think about how you would feel if that were the case. And so that's why I think it's so stunning when we read this book, and not just in chapter 1, but all through Daniel, how positive Daniel is about his life. Considering where he is and the circumstances that brought him there, I think that his attitude, his positive attitude, in the way he conducts himself is just amazing. So they get to Babylon, and basically several things happen to them. They're put into essentially a 3-year training program. Verse 5 says it's to prepare them to enter the king's service. So was this an exercise in brainwashing? Was this like a Babylonian brainwashing that was taking place, or was it just to prepare them to serve in the king's court by educating them? And I think the answer is probably a little bit of both of those things is what Nebuchadnezzar's intent was. And it's evident from this chapter that Nebuchadnezzar, his intent was to have them function like Babylonians. He wanted them to learn the Babylonian language. He wanted them to eat the food of the Babylonians. He wanted them to be called by their Babylonian names, which we'll talk about a little bit in a second. And then also we'll see in chapter 3 that he wanted them to worship the Babylonian gods as well. But he also wanted something else, I think, and that would be that anytime a country like Babylon has just, conquered an entire world, or at least part of the world, so to speak, they begin to run out of resources. And so they're going to need help from people from conquered countries to help them kind of understand those countries. And also, they're going to need people to help serve as officials to oversee those lands that they've conquered. So in an expanding empire, you're going to need more and more resources from other countries to serve important roles in those countries. And we actually have examples of this from even as far back as the 14th century BC, which is about the same time that the Israelites, or the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. There was a document called the Amarna Letters, which was written by Canaanite kings who were subjects of the Egyptian Pharaoh. And so in these letters, these kings talk about how they were taken to Egypt by Pharaoh. They were trained in the Egyptian ways, and then they were sent back as leaders and kings to places like Jericho and Jerusalem. So just kind of like what's likely being done here. You're going to train these young men, and you're going to send them back to the countries that are vassal countries to you. So we see here that the king places Ashpenaz, who's the chief of the court officials, in charge of them. And so there's some positive things, I think, that are going on here for them. Despite the fact that they're hundreds of miles away, they're living in the finest quarters that they probably could. It's not that they're being put in the slums. They had the best teachers, they're given the best food, and they had excellent protection. So really, what could be so bad with what's going on? So I think let's look into that a little bit. And I think the first question we need to answer, and something you may have heard of before, is that when you look at Ashpenaz, so some versions you have, so the NIV that I read said that he's chief of the court officials. Well, if you have an NIV or an RSV, you may read that he was the master of his eunuchs, or he was the chief eunuch, which basically means he was in charge of the units. And so apparently the same Hebrew word can mean the same thing, whether it be chief of the eunuchs or chief of the court officials. So does this mean that Daniel and his friends were made eunuchs when they got to Babylon? Well, the Bible never tells us exactly if that's the case or not, but I do think we could make a strong argument that that was the case, that they did become eunuchs. And so just a couple of reasons. One is it was just a common practice. When you brought people in the court to serve the court officials, it was very common to make them eunuchs. The second thing is we don't ever read anything about Daniel and his friends having wives or any children. But maybe the most compelling evidence comes from about 100 years before this, during the reign of King Hezekiah. So during that time, 100 years before, the Assyrians were the powerful empire. They were the Babylonians, the way the Babylonians now, that's the way the Assyrians were then, as we talked about last week. And so the Babylonians were just a vassal country for the Assyrians. But during this time, during the reign of King Hezekiah, the Babylonians were considering rebelling against the Assyrians. And as a result, they wanted to try to get the Israelites to be a part of that as well. And so they send an envoy to King Hezekiah. I'm just going to read a little bit of this from Isaiah chapter 39, this story. So verses 1 through 4 is what I'm going to read first. It says, "At that time, Marduk-Baladan, son of Baladan, the king of Babylon, sent Hezekiah letters and a gift, because he had heard of his illness and recovery. And Hezekiah received the envoys gladly and showed them what was in his storehouses, the silver, the gold, the spices, the fine olive oil, his entire armory, and everything found among his treasures. There was nothing in his palace or in all his kingdom that Hezekiah did not show them. Then Isaiah the prophet went to King Hezekiah and asked, "What did those men say, and where did they come from?" He said, "From a distant land," Hezekiah replied. "They came to me from Babylon." And the prophet asked, "What did they see in your palace?" He said, "They saw everything in my palace," Hezekiah said. "There is nothing among my treasures that I did not show them." So in this particular situation here, Isaiah, as a prophet of God, right, he's representing what God wants here in talking to Hezekiah. And the viewpoint of God is that Israel should never enter into an alliance with a foreign nation. And so that's why Hezekiah's actions here are problematic. And so now let's listen to what Isaiah tells him. So this is what Isaiah's response was to him in verses 5 through 8. He says, "Hear the word of the Lord Almighty. The time will surely come when everything in your palace and all that your predecessors have stored up until this day will be carried off to Babylon." That's the prophecy we talked about earlier. "Nothing will be left, says the Lord." Now listen to this. "And some of your descendants, your own flesh and blood, who will be born to you, will be taken away, and they will become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." So I think that's a pretty good indicator that perhaps that's what happened to Daniel and his friends, that they became eunuchs. Again, we don't know for sure, but I think that there's a good chance that that's what they did. So,
He wanted to make a eunuch any man that might have access to the queen or the harem, because any man that had sex with one of those women had a claim to the throne.
Yeah, okay. So Royce is basically, you're going to keep them in control by doing that, right? So I think that's a good, and I think that's why that was the first point, that was pretty much a common practice during that time. If you got brought into the court like that, they were going to make you a eunuch. So immediately after Daniel and his friends get there, there's some problems that begin to rise. They're going to challenge the faith of Daniel and his friends. So, and the first thing, and a big thing, I think, is that they were given new names. And, it's not like changing my name from Saul to Steve, right? That's not a big deal. This was something, though. These new names were going to go to the heart of who they were religiously. And so to Daniel in Hebrew means God is my judge. And so he was given the Babylonian name of Belteshazzar, which means Bel protects my life. And so Bel was just another name for Marduk, who was the chief god of the Babylonians. Hananiah means Yahweh has been gracious to me, or Yahweh has been gracious. And he was given the Babylonian name of Shadrach, which means the command of Aku. And Aku was the name of the moon god that the Babylonians served. Mishael in Hebrew means who is what God is. And he was given the Babylonian name of Meshach, which means what is, or who is what Aku is. And then finally, Azariah was given the Babylonian name of Abednego, which means a servant of Nebo. And in the Babylonian religion, Nebo was the son of Marduk. So these guys who are faithful Jews are now having their names changed to names of gods of these foreign countries. And I think one thing that's interesting to point out, although I don't really have an answer for this, is that all throughout the rest of the book, despite the fact that they're all given Babylonian names, except for a couple of cases throughout the rest of the book of Daniel, Daniel's referred to as Daniel, but the other ones are all referred to by their Hebrew names. And I'm not sure why that is. There's some people that speculate. I'm not sure there's really a good answer to it, but it's just an interesting thing to point out. So the second problem that arises, we see in verse 4, is that they were taught the language and literature of the Babylonians. And so on the surface, this doesn't seem like it would be a big deal. It seems kind of a benign thing, but in reality, this was just as toxic to their faith. First of all, the language, and we talked a little bit last week about the Babylonian language being Aramaic. That was kind of the common language, but really the language that they would have learned the most was a language called the Akkadian language, which is what all their literary compositions were written in. Their divination texts, which we'll talk about in a second, and religious texts were all written in Akkadian. And apparently Akkadian was an extremely difficult language to learn. And so we know that they learned it pretty well, because at the end of the chapter, they're better than anybody at it. But really even more challenging to their faith would have been the literature that they had to learn. And so one thing that would have included is learning the stories of the Babylonian gods, including the story of their god Marduk, and how Marduk created the world and the cosmos, and how Marduk created human beings. They would have had to learn, a creation story that they didn't believe in. And then, even worse than the literature, is that they would have had to learn the divination practices of the Babylonians. That would have included astrology. And then another form of divination that the Babylonians used is they would actually sacrifice lambs, and they would take their liver out. And then they would study their liver for the consistency and color of it. And then based on that, they would be able to predict the future or what the God's intents were for them. And then probably even the biggest part of their training was the fact that they would need to learn dream interpretation. And that was a big deal for the Babylonian wise men. And the way this worked was that someone would have a dream, and if they felt like the dream was something that was important for the future, then they would come to these wise men and they would tell them the dreams. And then the wise men would go back and they would consult these commentaries, these dream commentaries that they had, and then based on that, they would come back and tell them the interpretation of the dream. And we actually have records of the Babylonian dream commentaries that had even been translated into English. And I think there's like a Babylonian collection at Yale University where you can go and read the Babylonian Dream Encyclopedia. So these are all obviously things that would have been toxic and challenging to these guys' faith. And again, by saying at the end of the story that Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were the best of the best, it means that they were the best at the Babylonian language, the Babylonian literature, and they would have been the best at dream interpretation and divination, liver reading, or whatever it might be, all things that go directly against their faith. However, of all those things, it seems that the most significant problem was the food and the wine. And we see in verse 5, the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. And we're told in verse 8 that food, the royal food and wine, was going to defile them in some way. And so the question is why? Why would this royal food and wine be something that was defiling to them? Why did they feel like they needed to take a stand here? And so I think we can discuss that a little bit. I think one thing that can help us is in Daniel chapter 10, verse 2. I'm just going to read a passage to you. It says, at that time, and in Daniel chapter 10 is the third year of King Cyrus. So that'd be 536 BC. So we're like 70 years removed from where we are right now. So it says, at that time, I, Daniel, mourned for 3 weeks. I ate no choice food, no meat or wine touched my lips, and I used no lotions at all until the 3 weeks were over. So it seems here that what Daniel's saying in chapter 10 is that his decision in chapter 10 to not drink food or wine, or not eat meat or drink wine, was a temporary measure, that it's something, or that this isn't something that characterized his later life. Meaning if he's going to stop it then, it means at some point he was drinking the wine and eating meat. And so why is it defiling to him at this point here?
It's not kosher.
So Roy said it's not kosher, and certainly that's one argument, and probably the one you've heard the most, that because it's unclean food that they were being served, that they felt like that they shouldn't eat it. So if that were the case, then why would it be a temporary thing? Why would the food and wine have not been kosher then, but then later on, it would have been okay for them to eat it? Also, we know that wine isn't prohibited, right? Wine was something that Jews could drink, and so that kind of goes a little bit against that argument. Another one you might have heard is that because the food and wine had been offered to idols, it made it something that they didn't want to take part of. And I think that argument is a little bit based on maybe the Roman understanding of sacrifice, where the Romans would sacrifice meat and wine to their gods. In fact, in Babylonian culture, the Babylonians, they sacrificed everything to their gods, which would have meant that even the vegetables would have been sacrificed to the gods. So that kind of goes a little bit against that argument as well. Another one might be, could it be political? Like maybe they're trying to make a statement here to avoid serving the king in some way, or trying to undermine his rule by not eating from his table. But they do eat his vegetables, which means that they are still, technically eating from his table. And we also know that Daniel develops a very close relationship with Nebuchadnezzar. So it's not like he's trying to avoid Nebuchadnezzar or avoid serving him. So let me give you one other argument that I'd actually never even heard before. But it's a guy in one of the people that I've been studying some from is a guy named Tremper Longman, and he is a historian, an Old Testament historian, but specifically a historian of the ancient Near Eastern culture and also the Babylonians as well. And so he says that one interesting verse we need to look at is at verse 10, where the official's response to Daniel was this. He said, "Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age?" So what does that mean, to look worse than the other young men or the other wise men? So I think that seems to indicate that there must be an ideal way that these men need to look, right? So the king has some type of expectation for how they should look. And so he said, how can we know this? Well, the Babylonians had left all these sort of pictorial depictions, or I don't know if a fresco is the right word, I don't know art well enough, but anyway, pictures on walls, especially in the palaces and things like that. They left pictures. And so we have archaeologists over the last 100 or so years have been able to find and locate these pictures. And so we get a kind of an idea of what the Babylonian culture was like. And so in these pictures, if you see pictures of a king or of warriors, they look kind of like what you'd think. They're muscular, strong looking, mighty. But when you look at pictures of the wise men, they're depicted as fat and bald, which seems amusing. But right, every culture has an idea of how they think people should look, or what they think is beautiful. And he even points out that in a culture where maybe the ability to have food makes you rich and powerful, the fatter you are, the more powerful you are. So he believes that the diet and the way that Nebuchadnezzar wants him to look is he wants him to look like chubby wise men. And I think I could buy that perhaps. So whatever the reason, whatever it is, I think the main point here is that Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are trying to demonstrate their complete dependence upon God and his divine sovereignty. They're trying to show that God is in charge by saying, hey, give us only vegetables and water. Let me just make a little side note here. So I think it was about 5 years ago, Jana told me about this diet called the Daniel Plan. Have y'all heard that? Rick Warren did it. And so the goal, I think, was to eat this healthy food, and you're supposed to be more spiritual by doing this and things like that. And I did it for about 3 days, or maybe not even 3 days. I was mean. I was like mad. I mean, she was feeding me quinoa and all this stuff. And come to find out, Daniel was trying to get fat. I mean, I think he was completely wrong in the diet that he was pushing. So Don't do the Daniel plan the way Rick Warren describes. So now imagine yourself in this situation, right? So you're living in a strange land where no one cares about your guide or your standards. So what should you do, or what would we do if we were in this situation? And I think it's really important for us to look and take note of the wisdom that Daniel shows here. And I think we need to pray for wisdom to know where we need to draw a line, to know or to have the knowledge from God what we need to take a stand on in our life. What's an important thing that God wants us to take stands for? And I think it's really interesting here to look at what they were willing to do or let go. You know, things that probably all of us would be like, why in the world would you do that and yet take a stand on the food, right? They didn't refuse to change their names. I mean, could you imagine changing your name to something that honored Satan or, you know, some other god, right? They didn't refuse to learn a new language. They didn't refuse to learn the literature and the divination practices of the Babylonians. I mean, this is the occult that they're dabbling in, and we know God didn't have anything to do with any of that stuff. Yeah, you must have come in late. Yeah, we talked about that. Yeah, I think probably so. Yeah. So they accepted their new roles that they had in Babylon, and they served honorably in the Babylonian Empire, I would say. And Daniel wasn't shocked or upset that the Babylonians lived like Babylonians, right? He didn't try to change what they were doing. We're going to even see later that they didn't refuse to be honored by the Babylonians. They elevated Daniel to the second in command of the entire Babylonian kingdom. And we also know that it wasn't because they're scared, right? Because we're going to see that all four of them were willing, if they thought challenged their faith, they were all willing to die for their faith. So it's not because they were scared, but what they did do is they pre-decided where they were going to draw the line. And for Daniel and his friends in chapter 1, that line was drawn at eating the king's food and drinking the king's wine. And so I think it's a great lesson for us today that we need to make sure we choose battles that really matter. So to Daniel, he decided what was right, he declared what was right, and then even more important than that, he did what was right? He followed through it. And so what did they do? I love verse 8 because it says, Daniel resolved to do it. The Amplified Version actually says this: Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's food, which I think are pretty strong words to indicate the kind of conviction that Daniel had. And when the official Ashpenaz refused his request, he didn't give up, right? He just went to a different person, went to the person that actually served him the food, right? Verse 11 said he went to the guard. And so Daniel asked that he and his friends be given a test, right? To be served vegetables and water for 10 days and then to see at the end of that time how they compared to the others who'd been eating the royal food. And of course, we know that he agreed to do it for 10 days. I think another important point to say here is that Daniel held his convictions graciously, right? He took a stand without being obnoxious, right? He didn't say, look at me, look what I'm doing. In fact, from what we read here, this was all done privately, right? They didn't protest in public. They went privately and said, hey, we want to eat vegetables and water. They didn't go out there and say, hey, look what we're doing, look how great we are. He held on to his convictions without holding in contempt the people that didn't agree with him. He didn't try to make the Babylonians do exactly what he was doing. He did what God wanted him to, what he thought was right. And also notice how polite Daniel was. When the chief official refused his request, he didn't throw a fit. He didn't stomp his feet and get mad at him. He just moved on to the guard and asked him politely if he would honor his request. And so what happened after 10 days? Verse 15 says, at the end of 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So Daniel's determination had paid off, and God was blessing him. Verse 17 says, to these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. And then look at the end of the 3 years what the king found in verse 18. At that time, at the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief officials presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. So their faithfulness had led to great success. And so I think there's some key lessons that we can learn here from chapter 1. I just want to talk about that briefly. Maybe we have a chance if you want to ask some questions. So first of all I think the role of God in this chapter is important to point out. There's 3 verses. I think I put it on there. Well, no, I didn't. So maybe in your handout I put it. So verse 2 said, God delivered Jehoiakim into Nebuchadnezzar's hands. So even though Nebuchadnezzar thought that he was in control here, it was God that was in control of Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 9 said, God caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel. Verse 17 said, God gave knowledge and understanding to Daniel and his friends. So I think the main point of that part is that God is in charge, right? Nebuchadnezzar might think he's in charge, but God's the one in charge. God's the one that gave success to Daniel and his friends. God is the one that caused the... I think the second thing is that God kept his promises to the Jews. In this case, it was a bad thing for the Jews, right? Because he told the Jews way back when Moses was leading them out of into the wilderness, if you don't stay faithful to God and stay away from idols, I'm going to send you off to a foreign land. As long as you're faithful to me, then things are going to work out good for you. But he told them what he was going to do, and that's what he did. I also think it's important to point out that God used Nebuchadnezzar to carry out his will. I think it's interesting in Jeremiah 25 and Jeremiah 27 in those prophecies, God refers to Nebuchadnezzar as my servant, Nebuchadnezzar. So just another phrase to indicate that God was in control of what was happening. And then also God wanted Daniel and his friends to be his representatives in a foreign, godless country. And so because of that, God protected them. And then finally, I like, this is actually a statement or phrase from Rick Ashley in one of his sermon series. He said, Daniel served God in Babylon, and Daniel also served Babylon for God. Daniel served... did you say? I thought somebody was saying something to me. So Daniel served God in Babylon and served Babylon for God. And so we're going to see here that Daniel is going to be a valued member of a society that has values that he doesn't personally embrace. And I think this is critical for us today because I think we, as Christians, sometimes we can take several different attitudes when we're in a situation where our, whether it be at work or where we live or at school, where we're around a lot of people that don't believe the same things that we do. And so sometimes we can isolate, right? So we decide we're just going to form our own little Christian community and we're just going to isolate and get away from anything that's contrary to the values that we hold. The second thing we might do is protest, right? So we might pull away, but not pull away, but instead push back, right? We're going to declare a culture war, scream, post on Facebook, whatever it might be to protest against what we think are contrary to our values. Or the third thing is we might just give in. It's too hard to fight. You could see how it would have been easy for Daniel and his friends just to give up or give in. But I think there's got to be a better way for us to live in Babylon, which in my opinion, not this, but out there is Babylon, right? Where we are every day is Babylon. And so Daniel shows us that we can hold on to our values and still be respected in a culture that doesn't hold those values that we have. Daniel shows us that it's possible to be a blessing to the culture that we're living in without believing what that culture believes. And then I think a great example for that is Joseph, right? What did Joseph do? God put Joseph in Egypt, in Potiphar's house, to be a blessing, really to save Egypt is what Joseph did. And he did the same thing with Daniel. He put Daniel in Babylon to serve Babylon. And so I think he puts you and God puts me in situations in our life. And I think we need to pray for the wisdom to know, how we're supposed to act in those situations. How can we be a witness for God the way that he wants us to? And I think Daniel's a great example of how we can do that. All right. Questions?
Do you think, I always felt amazed at the fact that when they were carried to Babylon, they didn't give up and think, well, God's turned his back on them.
Right, absolutely.
They didn't.
Yeah.
They stayed faithful.
Yeah.
I guess that's amazing.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's so important to point out too is their prayer life, and we'll talk about that, throughout the rest of the book. But they just, they prayed daily, multiple times a day. I'm sure. We know they prayed with a window open towards Jerusalem, so they were believing that God was going to not only help them while they were in Babylon, but also get them all back to Jerusalem one day.
Nebuchadnezzar does not honor God, does not recognize Jehovah, but he will in about 2 or 3 chapters when he's out in the pasture eating grass.
That's right.
And actually they survive the burning furnace.
That's right. Yeah.
Everyone that's ever been born will eventually acknowledge God.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
For a century, one or the other.
Yeah, and I think, one thing, Homer Haley, who's another commentator that I used, he talks about the fact that he thinks that the fact that Nebuchadnezzar, took those articles and put them back in the temple as gods means that he was deeply religious. He was serving the wrong gods, but it'll come back, as Doug points out later on, to where he acknowledges God as the one true God. So, anybody else? All right, so read chapter 2 next week if you can, because we won't have time to read all the way through that like we did with chapter 1. All right, thank you.